Get ready to learn how I'm going to make the 2024 Nosferatu film more compelling so you can apply these storytelling techniques to your e-commerce and digital products marketing. Before I get into my rewrite and my changes, let's discuss some Nosferatu movie details and Easter eggs. Originally released as Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror, often cited as a 1923 film, though it did premiere in 1922, this German expressionist film was directed by F.W. Murnau. It's an unauthorized adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, which led to legal challenges and almost its complete erasure, making its survival all the more legendary. The film is renowned for its eerie atmospheric visuals. Count Orlok, with his strange features and haunting presence, became an iconic figure. His design influenced countless portrayals of vampires thereafter. In 1979, Werner Herzog remade the film as Nosferatu the Vampire. Herzog's version reimagined Murnau's classic with a modern sensibility, blending homage with fresh narrative elements. His version kept a slow and creepy feel, but also added deep sadness and personal reflection to the vampire story. In the year 2000, a film that created a fictional account of the making of the original Nosferatu was released. It blurred the lines between history and myth, further cementing the classic film as a cultural touchstone. The film was redone most recently by Robert Eggers in 2024. Eggers is known for his meticulous historical period details in films like The Witch and The Lighthouse. Robert Eggers saw Nosferatu as an opportunity to deepen its atmospheric roots. His version is not just a retelling, but a reinvention, grounded in historical context, yet exploring the psychological dimensions of horror. But when I watched the film, I can honestly say I did not enjoy it. The group I was with also felt it was rather boring and strange. We all agree the cinematography and the atmosphere were great, but felt like it was a missed opportunity to make a really good Nosferatu remake. So, in order to sharpen my storytelling skills and to help show you guys how to make a more compelling story for your e-commerce and digital product marketing, I figured I'd give rewriting Nosferatu a shot. Before we get into my rewrite, let's take a look at some cool Easter eggs from the 2024 Nosferatu film. Did you know that there were a number of character references in the movie? Thomas and Ellen's cat was named Greta. Greta Schroeder played Ellen in the original 1922 film. Also, Harding's first name was Friedrich. Friedrich was the first name of F.W. Murnau, the original director of the 1922 film. The professor, who was the Van Helsing stand-in for the movie, was named Albin. Albin Groh was the producer and production designer of the 1922 film. He was also an occultist. He was a lifelong student of the occult and later joined as a member of the occult society Fraternitas Saturni. Fraternitas Saturni translates to the Brotherhood of Saturn, and it was a German magical order founded in 1926. William Dafoe played Albin in the new 2024 film and offers schnapps at one point, which is a reference to his portrayal of Count Orlok in The Shadow of the Vampire film from the year 2000. In the 2024 film, they also use high-contrast lighting and production design to pay homage to the original film's haunting atmosphere. Robert Eggers' Nosferatu also uses shadows to show Count Orlok's supernatural abilities, like when Orlok reaches for stuff or is influencing a character, which pays homage to the original 1922 film. Robert Eggers also incorporated authentic elements of Transylvanian folklore and architecture in the film. Some of these elements included the castle itself, which resembled traditional Transylvanian castles, the reference to the group of vampire-like creatures, the Salomonari, which originate from Romanian folklore, the Eastern Orthodox Abbey, where Thomas Hutter is rescued by nuns, which is inspired by real monasteries in Transylvania, and traditional costumes worn by the characters based on historical clothing from the region during that time period. In Robert Eggers' Nosferatu, we also get some modern updates. Ellen is portrayed as a full character with more of a protagonist role. While the original 1922 film also made Ellen the hero at the end of the story, she didn't have as much backstory as the 2024 version of the character. In fact, the film critiques the suppression of women's sexuality and autonomy in that time period. Ellen's abilities and desires are seen as hysteria, showcasing the theme of women's struggles against society's norms at the time. Ellen's interactions with Orlok are used to explore women's sexuality. So in essence, we can say by the movie details that Robert Eggers' Nosferatu is a subtly feminist retelling of the original 1922 Nosferatu. If you're still watching, congratulations! Our society is continuing to have shrinking attention spans, so it's the few, like you, that can focus who will be able to outperform everyone else and succeed. Before I go into my rewrite, make sure to like this video if you found the Nosferatu movie details and Easter eggs interesting. Now, let's get into my rewrite. Ellen wakes up from a dream where she is being driven home by a carriage by her father. She looks back and sees Thomas in a carriage behind her, looking at her. Behind Thomas are the dark, shadowy claws of Nosferatu. The dream doesn't make sense to us, but we don't have time to make sense of it as she quickly tends to her garden in a panic to try and forget the dream. Thomas calls for her by the door before he leaves for work, and they kiss like two kids in love. Thomas leaves and Ellen sees the ghost of her father in her closet. When she goes to make herself some tea, the ghost tells her that she's a disappointment. Ellen quickly closes her eyes and continually whispers to herself, "My light outshines the dark, my light outshines the dark," and opens her eyes with the ghost no longer there. Thomas goes to work where his boss Nock tells Thomas that he needs to go to Transylvania. Now he intends on selling Count Orlok the dilapidated manor across from Thomas and Ellen's house. Thomas questions the purchase and why he needs to go to Count Orlok, and Nock gets strangely short with Thomas about it, which is unusual for Nock. Nock also appears to be holding the letter from Count Orlok, which has a strange language and symbols on it. Nock holds onto it almost as if forced to keep it safe. Thomas thinks nothing of it, and at the end of the day goes home to Ellen to excitedly tell her about the big commission deal. Ellen is ecstatic. It'll give them enough money to get a home big enough for a family, and they celebrate by making love. Thomas starts getting rough during their lovemaking out of excitement, and Ellen revels in the pleasure, but then has a sudden flash of darkness. She quickly asks Thomas to be less aggressive. Thomas states, "But you appear to enjoy it." Ellen, flustered, explains that what she enjoys and what is acceptable are not the same. That night, we see Ellen's dream of marrying death with a huge smile on her face as darkness covers the town. As the shadows cover the people, they die of a plague. Ellen quickly wakes up and rushes to her garden to try and forget the dream. In the garden, she notices some of her flowers have been cut. Thomas, inside, puts the flowers in a vase. Ellen innocently asks why Thomas killed the flowers. Thomas explains that he felt he wanted to spruce up the inside of their house for her. He thinks it's too dreary inside, which is why he believes she always rushes outside when she wakes up. Thomas tells Ellen that he'll have her stay with Friedrich and his sister Annie while he's away so she'll have company. Ellen asks to remind her where Thomas is going, and Thomas explains that it's to a fellow named Count Orlok in Transylvania. Ellen's dream of marrying death rapidly rushes back to her and she drops the vase of flowers, shattering the glass. Thomas panics and asks what's wrong. Ellen breathes heavily, feeling stuck in her corset. She's having an anxiety attack and tells Thomas he can't leave. Thomas reminds Ellen that the money will allow them to move to a better place, away from the dilapidated castle and rundown area, a place where they can have a family. Ellen yells in frustration that she doesn't care. In anger, Thomas says that if she didn't care, she wouldn't rush outside to get away from the house every morning. Thomas brings Ellen to Friedrich and Annie's house. Ellen is clearly unhappy with the result of their spat. She feels she's been unheard and shut down. When there, Thomas carefully asks Friedrich if it's okay if he and his sister watch her, since he knows that he and Ellen have a history. Friedrich nonchalantly explains that it's fine and that it's long behind him now. Annie's quick to innocently show off their wealth and her feminine vanity to Ellen. Ellen is unimpressed though. Annie, in excitement, not having many female friends, says she'd love to do a makeover with Ellen to make themselves look more like the classic view of a high society woman. Ellen reluctantly agrees when she sees Annie's really alone. She doesn't have any other female presence in her life. Thomas takes his leave for Transylvania, much to the dismay of Ellen. He reaches a Romanian town and asks for a room. At the saloon, where the village shares drinks and fun, he says he's going to see Count Orlok. Suddenly, the town gets quiet. The townspeople beg him not to go, telling him to be careful of the werewolves and vampires at his castle. Tom is quick to scoff at their superstitions. To him, these people have not yet found logic and reason like his town of Wilburg. In his room, he sees a book about vampires and a note from the owner warning him to please rethink going to the castle. At night, Thomas notices the townspeople with torches heading to a grave. He sneakily follows them and sees them open a grave and stab a vampire in the heart. the vampire jumps up in torturous pain before slumping to his death. Thomas, in fear and panic, runs back and hides in his room. He thinks to himself that these people are crazy. What did he just see? After a lackluster sleep, Thomas wakes up in the morning to head to the castle. Near the castle, he is eerily picked up by a strange, riderless carriage. Inside the castle, he meets Count Orlok, a strangely young man who hides behind large clothes and hats. Thomas asks about the weird actions of the townspeople stabbing a corpse in the grave. Count Orlok tries to dismiss the conversation by saying that they are just superstitious. Thomas tries to pry further and states, but the corpse seemed to react. But Count Orlok angrily cuts him off, saying he doesn't want to hear any more of it. Clearly, the killing of the corpse stressed Count Orlok and hit a nerve. Thomas, confused, asks why Count Orlok wants to move away from his large castle and into his hometown of Wilsburg. Count Orlok stressfully states that he wants to retire to a land where there aren't such superstitions or strange behaviors. He says he wants to retire to a place where he once visited and it felt like home to him. He also carefully says that with the town's superstitious behaviors, he's beginning to feel unsafe. Thomas clumsily cuts his finger at the dinner table as he tries to figure Count Orlok out. Count Orlok tries to restrain himself from the blood and tells Thomas to be careful as blood is life-giving and how precious it is. Thomas strangely begins to feel sleepy and passes out. In the morning, Thomas feels a pain in his neck and finds bite marks. Without a second thought, he blames it on mosquitoes. He uses his logic to explain away the strangeness of the bites as two mosquitoes biting close to one another. Thomas, unaware of the dangers of the castle, writes a letter to Ellen asking her not to worry. He wrote to her that he should be home soon. As he opens the door of his room, he's shocked by rats running out from under the door. Skeeved, but still unaware of danger, Thomas goes to a servant of the castle and gives his letter for Ellen to the servant so he can give it to the carrier in town. Curious about who would work for such a strange man as Count Orlok, Thomas asks the servant how long he's worked for Count Orlok. The servant cryptically explains eternally, which Thomas finds strange. Thomas continues to question the servant and asks where the other servants are as the castle appears to be quite empty. The servant coldly explains that the servants of the castle have been attacked by the townspeople, which is why they feel unsafe staying there. Thomas asks if Count Orlok will bring them when he leaves, and the servant explains that he will no longer need them and will most likely dispose of them. This freaks Thomas out. Ellen and Annie are having their makeover. Annie's really into it, but Ellen is looking far off into the distance in deep thought. Ellen, no longer able to keep her thoughts in, asks Annie if she ever felt like there was a side to her, another person inside who would tell her to do things against societal norms. Annie asks if Ellen means God, and Ellen says no. The person is herself, just darker, a shadow. Annie reluctantly explains that their mother also felt such things and gave in to dark desires. But Annie quickly tells Ellen that she shouldn't speak of these things. Annie angrily says her mother was bound and eventually put away for it. Annie then sadly states that she wouldn't want Ellen to meet the same fate. At night, Thomas signs the contract, though it's written in Count Orlok's original language, so he can't read it. Count Orlok asks about Thomas's locket. Count Orlok looks inside and sees Ellen, and it looks like he recognizes her. Thomas, questioning the recognition, asks if she reminds Count Orlok of someone he knew. Count Orlok longingly says she does, someone he thought he'd never see again. Count Orlok speedily changes the subject and pays Thomas the commission. Thomas then uses the end of the transaction as a perfect time to go home as he says he feels ill, but Count Orlok angrily says that he'll stay the night or risk offending him and canceling the deal and the payment. After Count Orlok leaves for his room, Thomas tries to escape in a panic, but everything is locked. In the hallway, he sees Orlok's shadow and is revealed as the pale, bald Nosferatu floating towards him. Thomas hurries to hide in his room and locks the door. Count Orlok unlocks the door with his shadow and comes in. He then uses his shadow to make Thomas fall asleep. Count Orlok then slowly goes in for the kill, with the plan of sucking his blood dry now that the deal has been completed. Suddenly, Ellen senses Thomas in danger and yells out for him. Count Orlok senses Ellen's connection and stops in his tracks. He leaves Thomas, hurriedly taking his coffin of dirt, and heads out of the castle. Nosferatu's shadow overtakes the room Ellen and Annie are in, but only Ellen sees it. Ellen quickly tries to close her eyes and mutter to herself, "My light outshines the darkness." Nosferatu confidently tells her that they'll be together again soon. Ellen yells in fear and frustration and passes out. Annie sees Ellen's strange behavior, and when Ellen passes out, she rushes to get Friedrich to call the doctor. The doctor visits Ellen in the guest room she's staying in, and Coley claims it's hysteria due to having too much blood. In the town, at night, Nock is ravishing and consuming the blood of living sheep. He is spotted and found by the police. As they grab Nock to take him away, Nock yells that his master is coming and all will fall to his darkness. In the morning, Ellen wakes up in a panic as she finds herself tied to the bed. Annie looks at Ellen in sadness for her friend and sees a sudden flashback of her mother tied to the bed. Annie decides to go to Ellen to calm her down. Ellen hurriedly explains that Thomas is in trouble. Friedrich Coley comes in with a letter from Thomas and reads it out loud. The letter was the one Thomas had sent earlier, where he talks about the mosquito bites and asks Ellen not to worry. Friedrich then asks if that sounds like Thomas is in trouble. Annie looks at Ellen with sadness and confusion, not sure if she should or can believe Ellen. Ellen desperately tries to explain that it's not true. She says that Thomas is in trouble and that they're all in trouble. Friedrich Coley tells Annie not to trust Ellen as she's always been crazy. Friedrich then leaves. Annie then slowly and reluctantly leaves too, with Ellen begging Annie to believe her. Thomas groggily wakes up in the morning, still feeling ill. In a desperate attempt to escape, he uses his bed sheets to climb down the window of the bedroom, but he passes out halfway down and falls into the ocean. In the ship, carrying Nosferatu's coffin to Thomas and Ellen's hometown, Wisburg, sailors are getting sick. The healthy sailors, in fear of their health, quarantine the sick below with the coffins, but the sick sailors scream in fear not to leave them alone below deck. Nock, in his prison cell, is visited by the doctor. The doctor inquisitively tries to understand Nock's mental breakdown. Nock rambles on about his master being a vampire and how blood is a life force that must be consumed to feed death. The doctor worries that the hysteria may be contagious, connecting that Nock was the boss of Ellen's husband, Thomas. He rapidly tells the police captain to quarantine Nock and that he needs to speak to Professor Bulwer. Professor Bulwer studies psychoneuroimmunology, which is the study of how bacteria and viruses can trigger psychological responses like hysteria, delusions, and paranoia. Ellen calls for Annie as she watches Annie walk by the room. Annie tried to rush past so as not to be seen in order to avoid looking Ellen in the eyes. Annie stops at the doorway, but doesn't look at Ellen. She asks Ellen what she needs. Ellen desperately asks Annie to look at her. Annie reluctantly looks, and again sees her mother in Ellen. Ellen asks Annie to believe her, woman to woman. Ellen pleads that she can't help find Thomas if she's bound to the bed. Annie slowly makes her way to untie Ellen as she says in sadness that her father would tie their mother to the bed so she wouldn't go out and sleep with other men. Ellen asks Annie if her mother loved her father, and Annie sadly responds that she didn't. Her mother was forced to marry their father due to her pregnancy with Friedrich, and she stayed with their father for them. As Annie unties Ellen, she states that her mother was stifled by her husband, her religion, and her society. But rebelling only locked her up tighter. Ellen, feeling her freed wrists, looks at Annie and says, with empathy, "Thank you, Annie." And Annie cries. In a lecture hall, the professor is teaching students about rabies and how it can lead to neurological symptoms, but also uncontrollable aggression and hydrophobia, which strikes fear into those infected. He confidently links rabies to the legends of werewolves. The professor then explains how outbreaks of ergo poisoning caused by fungus infecting rye led to hallucinations and convulsions. He links them to the Salem witch trials, where hysteria spread like wildfire, leading to accusations and executions. Then the professor links symptoms of anemia, light sensitivity, and a craving for blood being linked to the medical condition porphyria. Diseases like the plague and tuberculosis, which caused wasting away and pale complexions, also gave rise to the fearsome image of the vampire, explains the professor. The doctor then enters the lecture hall nervous and asks the professor to help in a matter of urgent importance. Ellen, staring out to the ocean, sees a ghost woman that Ellen recognizes as Friedrich and Annie's mother, Mrs. Harding. Ellen quickly closes her eyes to mutter her phrase, but then stops herself. She slowly opens her eyes. Mrs. Harding concernedly tells Ellen that she needs to stop pushing them away and instead work with them to help. Mrs. Harding warns that death comes for us all, but it's not yet Friedrich or Annie's time. Ellen says in defeat that no one believes her. Mrs. Harding warmingly tells Ellen not to let the voice of the majority drown the voice of the minority. The police arrive to caution Friedrich that they need to quarantine Ellen. Friedrich questions why, and they state that Knock has shown signs of possible contagion and that the doctor believes Ellen may also have been infected. It then dawns on Friedrich that Thomas has not yet returned from his trip. Friedrich assuringly tells the police that he'll isolate Ellen and not to worry. Friedrich goes to Annie and Ellen and concerningly states that they found Knock eating sheep alive and that Thomas may really be in danger. Thomas wakes up in a panic in the Romanian village. They tell him that the only reason he's alive is because death has not yet finished its job. They warn Thomas he has one foot in the grave as he is still unwell. Thomas gets up with pure determination and says he has to stop Count Orlok as he's going to kill Ellen and everyone in Wilsburg. The Romanians caution Thomas that he may not make the journey back since he's still unwell. Thomas decides to leave anyway to save Ellen. Before he leaves, the Romanians give him the vampire book he had read in the hotel room earlier. The ship's crew has dwindled down to just the captain and one sailor. Everyone else has died and has been thrown overboard. The sailor angrily decides to go down to the bottom of the ship and open the coffin to see who is killing their shipmates. From the darkness, Nosferatu strikes and kills the sailor. Nosferatu decides he can't waste any more time and rushes his claws and teeth into the captain. After killing the captain, he pilots the ship himself. Knock, ecstatic, senses Nosferatu coming near to Wilsburg in his cell. Friedrich, Annie, and Ellen argue over trying whether or not to speak with Knock to find out where Thomas was sent. Friedrich believes it's a bad idea in case he does have a contagion, as it would infect them. Ellen adamantly believes Knock may be holding the key to finding Thomas and that he is not diseased, but cursed by death. Annie desperately wants Ellen to be right as she feels this is her chance to redeem herself for never standing up for their mother. Friedrich decides that he'll go to see Knock as the police want Ellen quarantined and will take her if they find her. Knock patiently waits for a guard to feed him and then uses that opportunity to rush the guard, biting and killing him before escaping. Nosferatu's ship, having arrived at shore, is being investigated by the police. The police captain finds the logbook of the captain of the ship, which shares details of how they were all getting sick on the ship and dying. He cautions the rest of the police to be careful with the bodies. The police captain concludes that it's a new plague. Nosferatu eagerly looks out from the window of his new home, the dilapidated manor, to look across at Ellen's home, but Ellen is not there. She is still staying with Friedrich and Annie. Nosferatu, after noticing she isn't home, becomes patiently determined. Friedrich goes to the police and asks to speak with Knock as Thomas is missing, but the captain, overwhelmed, says he has enough to worry about with a possible plague outbreak and Knock's escape, which was a slip as he didn't want that info getting out. Ellen senses Thomas arriving and rushes outside to see him arriving on horseback, but he's ill. She embraces Thomas with a longing embrace. Thomas collapses from exhaustion. The professor and the doctor investigate the bodies from the ship. The professor finds it strange that all their blood has been removed from their bodies, not knowing what disease could do that. The doctor cautions that they should still enact a curfew and try to prevent whatever it is from spreading. The police alarms everyone to lock themselves away in a quarantine until they figure out what's going on. Annie excitedly tells Friedrich that Thomas is back, but warns that he's ill. Annie wonders what's going on and why everyone is getting sick. She also questions why Friedrich chose to allow her to release Ellen and not quarantine Ellen. Friedrich simply explains that it's because he knows that Ellen has always been crazy. And if it's a disease she has, he would have had it already. Annie then curiously asks whether or not he believes Ellen. Friedrich coldly says of course not, he just knows she isn't contagious. Ellen warmingly speaks to Thomas, comforting him by his bedside. She tries to ask him what happened, and Thomas weakly says that death is real, and it's moved into Wilsburg. Townspeople start dying left and right every night. A police officer sorrowfully marks crosses on the doors of houses where people have died from this mysterious disease. The doctor and professor visit Thomas to see if he has the same disease. They notice the same bite marks, but don't understand why he, of all people, hasn't died or has had all his blood taken from him like the rest. The townspeople, in hysteria, chase Knock, believing him to be a vampire that is killing the townspeople as they saw him eating sheep alive and drinking their blood. The doctor, Friedrich, Ellen, Anna, and the professor discuss Thomas in the living room. The doctor believes that this disease must be a new contagion that slowly eats away at the blood and is causing everyone to believe it's a vampire. The doctor even quotes the professor's research on how sometimes these diseases can cause mass hysteria. The professor himself questions if his research applies here. He's unsure what to think of it yet. Ellen exclaims it is a vampire, but not just any vampire, it's Death himself. Friedrich and the doctor scoff at her and tell her to stop speaking like a crazy person and to keep quiet. Annie again sees her mother and Ellen. Annie bravens up and angrily tells them to let Ellen talk. Ellen cautions all the men to stop letting their blind faith in science and reason fool them into believing this is a normal disease. Ellen finally lets her frustration from being shut down over and over again turn into a rage against the men and how they only allow the things they can see dictate their lives when there's much more we cannot see. The professor approvingly agrees that science only comes after we try to reason things we don't understand. The professor surmises if it really is blood loss from a vampire, and the only reason Thomas is alive is because the vampire didn't get to finish their job, then they can try a blood transfusion to save Thomas. Knock hides with Nosferatu in the dilapidated manor and tells him that Ellen and Thomas are at Friedrich's home, which is why he hasn't seen Ellen. Nosferatu determiningly states that she can't hide from her destiny and she will be back. He then coldly tosses Knock out the window and to his death, saying he no longer needs Knock. Ellen desperately offers her blood for the transfusion to Thomas. The doctor and professor work on a plan to complete the transfusion. The doctor believes it's too risky because Thomas may not accept Ellen's blood, and they still don't know what makes some transfusions succeed while others fail. But Ellen determinedly says that Thomas's blood will accept her. The professor chooses to believe Ellen, stating that today they work off faith and science will just have to catch up. Friedrich pleads for them to do it back at their own home because if Thomas is to die, he doesn't want his friend's death to be in his home. The professor says that he and the doctor will get the necessary equipment. Ellen and Thomas tiredly go back to their home. Thomas is still not feeling well and is barely holding on. Ellen, as she puts Thomas's things down, finds the vampire book. She curiously reads the book and sees that Nosferatu can only be killed by a woman sacrificing herself to Nosferatu, allowing him to feed on her and distract him until the cock crows, exposing him to sunlight. The professor and the doctor arrive with the equipment and help them set up to transfuse the blood. The doctor is still cautious and unsure of what will happen. After what they believe to be a successful transfusion, the professor and the doctor leave Ellen and Thomas, asking them to rest while they investigate a way to stop the shadow of death over Wilsburg. When they leave, Ellen confesses to Thomas that she needs to tell him something about Count Orlok. She says all this death is her fault. She explains the story to Thomas of their first meeting, and we see it in real time as a flashback. A younger Ellen is with Friedrich in a carriage at the cemetery. She and Friedrich are sensual together and intend to sleep with each other. But, as it would be outside of wedlock and would be considered taboo, they were hiding at the cemetery. Ellen feels uneasy as she feels eyes all around her like they're being watched. We see that from her view, she sees all the dead spirits in the cemetery. Friedrich, trying to relax the mood, tells her to close her eyes and let go. They start passionately kissing. Friedrich essentially tells Ellen that he is but a lion and Ellen her small prey. But then Ellen bursts into laughter. Friedrich, in confusion, doesn't understand what's so funny. Ellen explains, between laughter, that his mother told her that Friedrich used to play as a lion and chase rabbits in the backyard, so all she could picture was a baby Friedrich roaring and chasing little bunnies. Friedrich explodes in anger, offended as his mother has been dead for over a year now, and Ellen couldn't possibly have talked to her as they just met recently. Friedrich angrily kicks her out and leaves her alone in a cemetery with no way home. Ellen cries in tears of all the spirits watching her. She feels uncomfortable. Then, a shadow appears and makes all the spirits vanish. The shadow warmingly tells her not to cry. Friedrich, on his way home in his carriage, sees Thomas walking outside. Thomas asks him where his secret date went. Friedrich angrily says he left her at the cemetery, she disrespected him, and claimed to have spoken to his dead mother. The shadow in the cemetery forms into a healthy young bald man very close to Ellen's face. The man, Nosferatu, tells her that he can feel her sorrow. He tells her that it feels delicious. He then kisses her. Back near Friedrich's carriage, Thomas, in fear of Ellen's safety, takes Friedrich's carriage to find her and bring her back home. A carriage arrives at the cemetery, but it's Ellen's father. Ellen, elated in orgasmic bliss, is naked on the floor of the cemetery. Her father exits the carriage and heads towards her, angrily yelling that she's crazy for talking to imaginary people and that no one will ever marry her now that she's unclean. Her father rudely throws her clothes on her and takes her away. By the time Thomas gets there, he sees Ellen's father driving her away in a carriage to go back home. Ellen catches a glimpse of Thomas and they lock eyes as she's taken away. Ellen looks sad but hopeful in Thomas's eyes. Thomas reflects the same look. Behind them, Nosferatu's shadow lingers over the cemetery. The flashback ends and Ellen is distraught, crying, stating that she gave in to her dark desires, that she was lonely, that she was susceptible. She says death was her first lover, but she has tried to stuff away the apparitions and her darkness. She says only Thomas gave her a chance to be part of the light, a normal woman. Thomas stops her and assuringly explains that her darkness is what attracted him to her in the first place. He was fascinated seeing her there in the graveyard in her sorrow, when other women were tending gardens with fake smiles and planning babies. Upon hearing that, Ellen finally lets go of her sexual frustrations and asks Thomas to be rough with her. That night, as Thomas is asleep, after their tryst, Ellen reads the newspaper. The newspaper exclaims how many lives have been claimed by this new plague. In sorrow and in search of answers, she sneaks into Thomas's things again to read the vampire book again. She rereads the section about how the only way to kill Nosferatu and save everyone is a female sacrifice. She then walks in fear to the window and sees Nosferatu staring at her from the dilapidated manor across from her. She closes the shades in panic. In the morning, instead of rushing to the flowers in the garden, Ellen determinedly speaks to the ghost of her father that she sees. She bravely tells her father that she chooses to be herself, to not hide parts of her anymore. She says she never needed anyone else's approval but her own, and if he couldn't love her, Thomas does. Thomas is in the other room and sees her talking to herself, but instead of being weirded out, he lovingly smiles. This is Ellen embracing all that she is. Thomas then switches gears and is determined to kill Nosferatu like the Romanians killed the vampires in their town. He goes over to the dilapidated manor, finds the coffin, and bravely opens it, readying the killing blow, but it's Nock's dead body. The police come to investigate as Thomas had called them after finding Nock. The captain determines that Nock must have killed himself, thinking he was a vampire. Thomas desperately tries to explain that Nosferatu is real, and he's Count Orlok, the man who purchased the manor. The issue is, the police state they don't have any evidence Count Orlok buying the manor. Thomas, in pure confusion, questions what documents he signed at Count Orlok's castle. Ellen stands stoically by the garden flowers, talking to Mrs. Harding about the sacrifice needed to stop death. Mrs. Harding encourages Ellen by telling her that it's not her light that will outshine the darkness, but her darkness that will let there be light. Back at the Harding home, Annie confesses to Friedrich that she wishes she was as self-actualized as Ellen and their mother, who don't try to hide their feelings or their dark desires. Friedrich cautiously explains that their dark desires will doom Ellen as they doomed their mother. Thomas explains to the doctor and the professor that the Romanians killed vampires in a village by stabbing them in their hearts in their coffins. He asks them to help him find Nosferatu and do the same. Night begins to fall, and Ellen sensually unrobes herself and looks out the window to see Nosferatu. She slowly and cautiously opens her window to let him in. Nosferatu takes his time making his way inside and coldly states that Thomas had already signed a contract handing her soul to him, so she need not be ashamed of their tryst this night. Ellen forcefully states that her soul is hers and hers alone. Thomas, the professor, and the doctor go back to the ship where all the sailors died and find another of Nosferatu's coffins, but he isn't there. The professor thoughtfully explains that according to folklore, if the sun rises before the vampire returns to the dirt in his coffin from his home, he'll surely die. But Thomas, confused, questions where Count Orlok would be if he's not in the manor and not in the ship where his coffin has been hiding. Nosferatu slowly feeds on Ellen. Thomas's eyes widen as he connects the dots and rushes back to his home to find Ellen. The sun's beams make their way over the town. Nosferatu looks at the sun, rising in concern, but Ellen weakly keeps him there, asking Nosferatu to continue. Thomas rushes to the door of their home, but it's locked. The sun's rays rise over Nosferatu and slowly burn him to ash as he screams in anguish. Thomas slams down the door and hurries to the bedroom. Thomas finds Ellen, weak and covered in ash. Thomas lovingly holds Ellen as he cries, asking what she's done. Ellen weakly explains that her darkness has made way for the light. Thomas cries out that he can't live without her. Ellen assures him, "My blood runs through you. We'll always be together." Annie, Friedrich, Thomas, the doctor, and the professor are at Ellen's cemetery. Friedrich whispers to Annie in anger that he knew her dark desires would be her downfall. But Annie warmingly explains that her darkness was the town's uplifting. We see the ghost of Ellen holding hands with Thomas at the cemetery as the shadows of the night fade away to make room for the morning. The sun beams on Thomas, who now holds himself and Ellen within his blood. The ghost of Ellen, in sorrow and a glimpse of hope, walks away from Thomas and towards the ghost of her father and Mrs. Harding in the light. She looks back one last time and connects with Thomas's eyes as they did the first time they met. Okay, so before I explain my changes and how you can apply these story-enhancing strategies, if you enjoyed that rewrite, make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. That way you can know when I release more story rewrites and breakdowns, as well as marketing tips for e-commerce and digital product businesses. While Robert Eggers' Nosferatu hints at the internal struggle of its characters, mine dives in and immerses us in Ellen's internal world. I also deep dive into the relationship between Thomas and Ellen, exploring their romance, vulnerability, and conflicts. While Robert Eggers' Nosferatu uses a strong atmospheric tone, mine uses dreams and flashbacks to heighten the sense of mystery while also exploring themes of identity and fate. I create open loops that make you wonder where the dreams or flashbacks are going, leaving breadcrumbs throughout the story to keep the audience engaged. I also create a more immersive world by focusing on the broader society with themes of science versus superstition. The dance between science and superstition in the film even makes you question what's real. It makes you engage with your viewpoints. Some people are more scientific, while others are more superstitious. In the story, we see what happens if you're too polarized to one side or the other, and it makes you think about your own polarization. While Robert Eggers' Nosferatu leaves subtle hints of repression and society's constraints, I give detail to the themes of freedom, struggle against society's norms, and acceptance of our inner darkness. I purposely dive deep to make the audience question their own darkness and whether or not suppression is the best way to go about working with it. Robert Eggers' Nosferatu uses production design to build a haunting atmosphere. Meanwhile, I use symbols like the garden, the cemetery, and ghosts to create a higher emotional impact while also providing haunting visuals and themes. I show instead of tell through flashbacks to the cemetery, dark dreams, and visions of ghosts to maintain that haunting atmosphere. Good production design in my rewrite would just add to the already haunting visuals mentioned in the story. Basically, my rewrite adds deep emotions and characters as well as a mix of myths psychology, and social ideas. This way, people can enjoy and think about the story more deeply. In order to add all this depth, before rewriting the story, I started out with my why of why the story even needed to be told. My why was a philosophical conflict. That conflict was whether suppressing darkness and living a good life on the outside but a hard life on the inside was better than integrating with darkness to live a balanced life inside but a difficult life on the outside. With this conflict, it speaks to all of us as human beings. We all have a dark side that we often suppress for society, but may lead to us releasing that darkness in less healthy ways. Meanwhile, sometimes integrating with that darkness can provide us a healthier life, but may put some people off. It's something we can all understand. Then, when rewriting the story, this conflict was kept at the top of my mind. When you're rewriting stories for your marketing, have you first decided why the story should be told? In this rewrite, I did lose some things from Robert Eggers' version. You see, my version removes some of the lean, ambiguous horror that Eggers relies on for his narrative. Instead, my version creates multi-layer narratives and deep character exploration. I essentially lost ambiguity for multi-layer characters. And I know you may be wondering, how do I apply these same story strategies to my products or brand? No worries, at the end I'll point you to something that will help you out. For now though, let me know in the comments what you liked or didn't like about my version of Nosferatu. Did you feel it was more compelling? Did you feel like the character explorations helped or hurt the story? Would you feel like you could watch this film and not get bored? By the way, if you'd like to link to a document I created that helps you find the story behind your brand and products, make sure to have the word story in your comment below. And since you've stuck around to the end, take a look at this video when it's released, where I break down the e-commerce store 10 Tree and how they made $4 million in revenue so you can learn how to apply their storytelling tactics to your brand and products.